There's a conversation happening everywhere right now about the kids these days, about Gen Z, about their phones, their attitudes, their anxiety, their boundaries, their slang, their politics, their everything. And then there's another conversation, much quieter, about the people who grew up in the 1960s, the ones who learned to live in a world where you didn't photograph your lunch, you didn't announce your feelings, and you didn't expect the world to explain itself to you. Most days, those two generations look at each other like they came from different planets. But I want to tell you something as an old woman who watched the 1960s happen in real time and who now watches Gen Z grow up with a front row seat. The difference isn't just technology. It's not just kids are softer or old people are out of touch. The difference is this: we were trained to survive quietly. They were trained to live loudly. And both of those trainings come with a cost. I grew up in a neighborhood where everybody knew your name, but nobody knew your business. That sounds like a contradiction until you've lived it. We knew who was sick, who was newly widowed, who had a son in Vietnam, who had a daughter in trouble, who had a husband drinking too much. We knew. We always knew. We just didn't say it out loud. In the 1960s, if you had a problem, you didn't post. You didn't vent. You didn't process. You swallowed it with your breakfast and you went to work, or you went to school, or you went to church, and you kept your face steady. And I can already hear someone young saying, "That's not healthy." And you're right, it isn't. But it was our normal. When I was a teenager, there was one phone in the house, and it was attached to the wall like a piece of furniture. If it rang, the whole house knew. If you wanted privacy, you stood in the hallway and turned your back and lowered your voice, like that made a difference. There was no blocking. If someone bothered you, you either dealt with it or you didn't answer. But if you didn't answer, your mother would eventually pick up and say, "Hello?" And then you were stuck. There was no escape hatch. There was one television, too, and it didn't ask you what you liked. You watched what was on. 3 channels, sometimes 4 if you counted the one that barely came in. And when nothing good was on, that was it. You sat there. You stared at the wall. You went outside. You got bored. And boredom wasn't treated like a crisis. Boredom was just the air you breathed. Now I look at Gen Z, and I see a generation that has never been bored the way we were bored. They have a whole universe in their pocket. They can scroll through 10 lifetimes in an hour. They can learn any skill, watch any place, hear any voice, find any community without leaving their room. And that is a miracle. But it's also a weight, because when you can see everything, you start to believe you must keep up with everything. When you have access to everyone, you start to feel guilty when you can't answer everyone. When you can compare your life to 1,000 edited lives every day, you start to feel like your real life is failing some invisible test. We never compared ourselves to the whole world. We compared ourselves to our cousin, to the girl down the street, to the boy in math class. Our circle was small. Your reputation was local. Your mistakes were private, unless you made them loud. Gen Z doesn't get that privacy by default. They have to fight for it. People like to romanticize the old days, so let me be honest. The 1960s generation had strengths, but we also carried a lot of quiet damage. We learned discipline early, not the cute version people post about, real discipline. You showed up on time because there was no text to say, running late. You just weren't late. If you were late, you were rude, or you were unreliable. That was it. No explanation. We learned to fix things because replacing things cost too much. My father could stretch $1 like it was elastic. Shoes got repaired. Dresses got taken in, taken out, hemmed, patched, handed down. Nothing was aesthetic. It was practical. And we learned to tolerate discomfort because nobody offered comfort the way people do now. If you were sad, someone might say, "Go wash your face." If you were nervous, they might say, "You'll be fine." If you were overwhelmed, you were told to stop being dramatic. It wasn't cruel in their minds, it was training. It made us tough, yes. It also made a lot of us emotionally illiterate. We didn't have the language for what we felt. We had stomach aches, headaches, tight shoulders. We had nerves. We had a temper. We had a bad week. We had trouble sleeping. We didn't have depression and anxiety in the way people talk about it today. Not because it didn't exist, because we didn't name it. Now Gen Z has names for everything. Sometimes too many names. Sometimes they diagnose themselves off a 30-second video and scare themselves. But you know what I envy? They can say, "I'm not okay," without feeling like they've failed at being a person. That is not weakness. That is progress. When I want to explain the difference between my generation and Gen Z, I tell a small story. In 1967, my friend Teresa and I worked after school at a little bakery. Not because we were ambitious, because we needed money. She was saving for nursing school. I was saving because my mother said, if you want nicer things, you earn them. We didn't call it hustle. We didn't call it grind. It was just life. One day, Teresa got burned pulling a tray from the oven. She hissed, shook her hand, ran it under cold water, wrapped it in a dish towel, and went back to work. The owner didn't say, "Are you okay?" He said, "Be careful." That's the 1960s in one moment. Pain happens, you keep moving. Now I think of a Gen Z girl I know, my neighbor's granddaughter. Bright, kind, funny. She works part-time while going to school, and when she's stressed, she says it out loud. She says, "I'm burnt out." She says, "I need a mental health day." She says, "I can't do everything." And you know what? She's right. She can't do everything. But when my generation hears that, some people get angry. They say, "We didn't get mental health days." And that's true. We didn't. We also didn't get to admit we were drowning. So the question isn't who had it harder. The question is, who is allowed to be honest about hard? Gen Z is honest. My generation was silent. And both styles have consequences. Let me talk about trust, because this is another big difference. People who grew up in the 1960s were taught, directly and indirectly, that institutions were stable. Not perfect, but stable. School, church, the bank, the local newspaper, the doctor, the government. These things carried authority. Then reality started cracking that belief. Vietnam, political assassinations, corruption, wars we didn't understand, promises that didn't come true, women being told their place was small, people of color being told to wait for justice like it was a bus that would arrive someday. We watched the country argue about what was right and what was real, and we watched adults pretend everything was fine. But even with all of that, institutions still felt like the only game in town. You couldn't go viral and pressure someone into accountability. You couldn't review bomb a company. You couldn't record someone secretly and post it. You didn't have that power. Gen Z grew up with a different lesson. Institutions are not stable, and you can watch them fail in real time on your phone. They watched the 2008 fallout as children. They grew up through endless political chaos. They saw a pandemic shut the world down. They watched prices rise and rent become ridiculous. They saw student death stories everywhere. They watched climate anxiety move from the future into right now. They watched school safety become a fear people carry daily. So when older people say, "Why doesn't Gen Z trust the system?" I want to say, because the system introduced itself to them with a warning label. And if Gen Z seems cynical sometimes, it's because they were raised inside receipts, screenshots, evidence, statistics, clips. They don't accept "because I said so" as an answer. My generation did, sometimes even when it hurt us. Now let's talk about relationships, because this is where the difference gets tender. In the 1960s, you didn't talk openly about feelings, so you showed love through duty. You cooked, you cleaned, you fixed, you stayed, you endured. You didn't always say, "I love you." You proved it by not leaving. That sounds beautiful, and sometimes it was, but it also trapped people in marriages that were miserable, unsafe, or just dead. Divorce was shame. Therapy was shame. Even admitting your husband was cruel felt like you were confessing a crime. Gen Z lives in a world where leaving is allowed. Boundaries are celebrated. Emotional intelligence is trending. Consent is discussed. People talk about red flags like they're weather warnings. This has made Gen Z more cautious, sometimes to the point of fear, but it has also made them more aware. They refuse a lot of what older generations tolerated. And when older people say they give up too easily, sometimes that's true, but sometimes it's not giving up. Sometimes it's refusing to bleed for tradition. My generation often stayed and suffered because that's what you did. Gen Z often leaves because they believe you don't have to suffer to prove you're good. I wish we had believed that sooner. Another difference, how we define success. In the 1960s, success was simple on paper: a stable job, a paid-off home, a spouse, children, a respectable life. You didn't ask if your job fulfilled you. You asked if it fed you. You didn't ask if your life matched your purpose. You asked if your family was okay. Gen Z asks different questions. Does this job align with me? Does this company reflect my values? Is this lifestyle sustainable? Is this relationship healthy? Do I even want kids? Do I even want marriage? Older generations can hear that and think it's selfish, but I don't think it's selfish. I think it's an attempt to avoid living someone else's script. And yes, sometimes Gen Z can be too idealistic. They can reject good opportunities because they aren't perfect. They can burn bridges because they expect every workplace to be emotionally safe all the time. But my generation often did the opposite. We accepted bad deals because they were available. We endured toxic bosses because we thought suffering was normal. We stayed quiet to keep the paycheck. Gen Z doesn't want to stay quiet, and that's the part that scares older people. Because when the young refuse to be silent, it forces everyone to hear what they used to ignore. Let me tell you the truth nobody likes. Both generations are carrying fear. It just looks different. The 1960s generation fears dependence. We fear needing help. We fear being a burden. We fear not being useful. We fear being old and invisible and left behind. Gen Z fears instability. They fear the future won't hold. They fear they'll work hard and still never afford a life. They fear everything is watched, judged, recorded. They fear they'll never be good enough, never thin enough, never successful enough, never calm enough. We feared the neighbor's opinion. They fear the internet's opinion. And the internet doesn't sleep. So what's the real difference between the generation that came of age in the 1960s and Gen Z? It's this. We were trained for endurance, and they were trained for exposure. Endurance teaches you how to keep going when no one is clapping. It teaches grit. It teaches you to show up when you don't feel like it. It teaches you to fix what's broken instead of throwing it away. Objects, relationships, yourself. But endurance can also teach you to accept what you shouldn't accept. It can teach you to stay quiet when you should speak. It can teach you to confuse suffering with virtue. Exposure teaches you awareness. It teaches you language. It teaches you community. It teaches you that you're not alone in what you feel. It teaches you to ask questions older generations never dared to ask. But exposure can also teach you anxiety. It can teach you to perform instead of live. It can teach you to measure yourself against 1,000 illusions. It can teach you to panic because there is always more information, more tragedy, more noise. The older generation needs some of Gen Z's honesty. Gen Z needs some of the older generation's steadiness. Because honesty without steadiness becomes panic, and steadiness without honesty becomes loneliness. If you're young and you're listening to an old woman talk, here's what I want you to take with you. Don't mistake silence for strength. A lot of the old people you admire didn't handle it because they were strong. They handled it because they didn't think they had a choice. If you can ask for help, ask. If you can name what you feel, name it. That's not weakness, that's a skill. But also, learn something real, something you can do with your hands or your mind when the internet goes quiet. Learn a skill that doesn't depend on attention. Build competence. Competence is a kind of peace. And if you're older, if you grew up in the 1960s, if you pride yourself on being tough, here's what I want you to hear. Stop teasing young people for having feelings. Feelings don't make someone fragile. Unspoken feelings do. The kids aren't broken because they talk about anxiety. They're trying to prevent it from turning into something worse. And please, for the love of God, stop saying I'm fine when you're not fine. That sentence has swallowed whole lives. If you have a Gen Z person in your life, don't dismiss them. Ask them how they're sleeping. Ask them what they're worried about. And then do something radical. Don't argue. Just listen. And if you're Gen Z with an older person in your life, don't write them off as outdated. Ask them what it felt like to be young without a safety net of information. Ask them what they lost by staying silent. You might learn what not to repeat. Because the truth is, every generation is a reaction to the one before it. And the best ones, the healthiest ones, don't just react, they learn. So the next time you hear someone say, "These kids are hopeless," or "Old people ruined everything," remember this: it's easier to judge a generation than to understand it. Understanding requires patience, and patience is in short supply right now. But patience is also what bridges are made of. And whether you grew up in the 1960s or you're Gen Z, we're all standing on the same bridge, trying to get to the same thing. A life that feels safe, meaningful, and real. Call someone who matters today. Not a text, a call. Hear their voice. Let them hear yours.